What I'm going to present to you today is sort of maybe a bit of a skeleton of the theoretical aspect of a book I'm working on, which is sort of a follow-up to this one. This one's called Crisis of Imagination, Crisis of Power. It came out a year and a half ago, I guess. And the subtitle of this book was Capitalism, Creativity, and the Commons. It was a collection, well, it still is a collection of essays on a whole range of topics. The first chapter is thinking again about what value means. The second chapter is on commons and the way that commons are distinct from the idea of the public. The third chapter ties into some of the research I've been doing, which is more in another book and in other articles on finance and financialization. This next book is going to be shorter and more contained. And it's going to attempt to take some of the things I've been learning about different types of commons-oriented efforts and put it in a framework that makes the idea of the commons a little more tangible and useful. Because one of the things that's happened, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with the discourse that surrounds the idea of the commons in the last few years, is it's actually exploded. I would say there's been an exponential growth in the number of people using the idea of the commons, and for good, mostly, but also for ill as well. The commons has this incredible promise as an idea to allow us to imagine something or some way of organizing ourselves as human beings, as social and ecological creatures outside of the market and outside of the sort of top-down power structures that we associate with the state, with the welfare state especially. And that's very, very promising, and it opens up the imagination in incredible ways. But there are also a lot of risks that go along with using and embracing the discourse and the enthusiasm for the commons. And it's some of those that I want to talk to you about today. I guess I would start by pointing out something that is totally obvious to most of us, but somehow needs to constantly be repeated, which is that in spite of the fact that the global economy, by the numbers, grows every year, it is a total abject failure. Capitalism has, I think we can say now, conclusively failed to make life better in an ecologically sustainable way for a large number of people. That failure, though, is being externalized. So some of you are familiar with the way that corporations talk about costs and economics. An externality is a cost that a corporation makes on the environment, onto social life, but that it doesn't have to pay for. So if a Canadian mining corporation, for instance, and in Canada, my home country, 60% is where 60% of the world's mining corporations are located. If that corporation goes and digs a gold mine and then poisons a whole ecosystem, as our largest gold mining corporation, Barrick Gold, just did in northern Argentina, the corporation can easily just walk away from the mess, cease operations in that country, and the costs of doing business, of digging all of that gold and processing it into a finished product that can be sold to global markets, is externalized onto the population, in the sense that now it's the responsibility of the state and the citizens to deal with the mess that's been created. This, as very influential commons thinking for me, Massimo De Angelis points out, is the basic operation of global capitalism today. It is the privatization of gains, the privatization of profit, and the socialization of costs. And this is happening at a local level in terms of different sorts of large corporations which specialize in sort of taking public wealth, generating property and private property and profit out of it, and then externalizing the costs in a whole variety of ways. But it's also happening on a broad systemic level, where increasingly what we're seeing is far from the vision that capitalist thinkers, pro-capitalist thinkers had in the early 20th century. Capitalism is in fact not lifting all boats, it's not making everyone richer, it's simply creating a sort of chaotic world where everyone is competing to avoid the worst effects. And we can see this in the financial realm, where essentially nation states are competing against one another to give one another this huge burden of debt that has been sort of floating around the global economy since 2008, and trying to force on relatively weaker countries certain forms of economic indebtedness in order to protect the larger economies. But this is happening in some ways everywhere. We're in a moment of a capitalist system where it seems that our only choice as subjects, whether we're subjects at the level of the individual, at the level of the city, at the level of the nation, is to compete against other subjects in order to avoid the worst effects of capitalism. And that's the only choice seemingly left to us. So we try in some ways to survive, we try and create some sort of economic betterment for ourselves, but it's always seemingly framed in terms of competing against others. So maybe that's competing against others in the city, maybe that's competing against others in emerging economies elsewhere, maybe that's competing against others within the EU. There's this sense that our imaginations have been reconfigured or reshaped by the forms of global capitalist competition, which have now become the norm, in such a way that we can't imagine any other way of working together. And really, I think that what it boils down to for me, and the framework that I use both in this book and I will use in the future book, is a global struggle over reproduction. So without going into too much detail, I'd be happy to in the discussion, there are various ways of theorizing this thing we call reproduction. One of them comes out of a Marxist tradition, which was, as you know, fixated on the production of commodities. So for Marx, the world hinged and social power hinged on who had the power to produce commodities, under what circumstances, and who would gain from the production of hard and fast things, whether they're bottles of water or digital projectors or books or whatever. Marx created this very comprehensive schema for understanding how the world was made up of commodities that could be bought and sold. As Marxist theory developed to try and account for things like imperialism or competition between nation states or finance, theorists including Rosa Luxemburg and others began to try and understand how capitalism was reproduced. Because for Marx, capitalism is always a system that's in constant crisis. It's constantly producing incredible things. It's creating incredible innovation through making people compete against one another in various ways. But it's also producing its own crises of overproduction of certain commodities, crises of underproduction of certain commodities, crises of inequality of wealth, so that people who are actually making the projectors or the water or the books can't get paid enough to actually buy the commodities that they're producing. All sorts of crises. And there are various ways that, in spite of these crises, capitalism can reproduce itself. And so some of them that are named are creating a financial realm where wealth and risk can be shared. Another one is imperialism. Another one is interstate competition. These are all ways that capitalism reproduces itself. And today, I think what we can take from the theories of Massimo De Angelis I mentioned before is that the key means by which capitalism as a system reproduces itself is by externalizing those costs onto various populations, whether it's through debt, whether it's through environmental degradation, whether it's through the exploitation of labor, whether it's through transforming us all and all social life into a site of consumerism. There are all of these ways that capitalism reproduces itself by feeding on everyday life. On the other hand, that has put us into a position of thinking more and more about politics as the realm of our own reproduction. So how will we reproduce our bodies in terms of health, in terms of food, in terms of water, in terms of care? How will we reproduce our social institutions in a time when they're increasingly being cut back or when they're facing budgetary cuts? How are we going to reproduce ethical life in a world where we're constantly forced to compete? And so what I've seen, and what the book is generally going to be about, is trying to reframe, and this work joins a number of other theorists in a similar effort, trying to reframe today's struggles around the commons as struggles over how we're going to reproduce social life together. And that's not just a question of biological reproduction in terms of reproducing bodies, reproducing children. These are important, and this theorization comes out of a Marxist feminist framework that sees this as a primary care and a primary form of work on which a capitalist system depends. But also thinking about reproduction in a broader frame as well. So how do we reproduce social life together? How do we reproduce forms of relationship? How do we reproduce images and ways of imagining together? Reproduction can be a very, very powerful concept for developing a way of talking about all sorts of things that we do. Even productive labor, even the production of physical things, even the production of water or production of food, is also at the same time a form of reproduction as well. It's producing the means by which we reproduce ourselves as a society. Essentially, the idea of the commons and the idea of reproduction open us up to thinking again and thinking very differently about the nature, the shape, and the coordination of social cooperation. As we all know, humans are a fundamentally cooperative species. We don't survive or thrive very well in isolation from one another. In fact, we are even at the level, not just at the level of our physical bodies and the built environment and the commodities that we use, dependent on cooperation, dependent on a distribution and a division of labor. We as subjects are as well, in the sense that we're here all in this room and we can enjoy a debate in a university because most of us don't produce our own clothes, we don't produce our own food, we are part of a network of social relationships that support us. And so we are essentially all, at the level of both body and soul and heart and mind, the products of social cooperation. As the global capitalist system expands and intensifies, an increasing amount of that social cooperation is dominated by the market and dominated by commodified social relations. So on one hand, of course, most of the food that we eat, most of the clothes that we wear are produced as commodities, they're produced for the market, and our only relationship to the people who produce them are through money, is through the mediation of a capitalist tool that we've developed in order to coordinate our social cooperation in some way that produces the necessities of life and produces the opportunities for our social reproduction. But we're at a very challenging time now where on the one hand we're seeing the increased commodification of social reproduction and of social cooperation. And at the same time we are developing the tools where we might actually be able to do that very, very differently on a very different set of principles or grounds. And that's both a very terrifying time and a very exciting time. And this is where I think the idea of the commons becomes especially useful, because what it promises us is a way to coordinate our labor and to reproduce our lives outside of either the two alternatives that we were always told were the only ones in the 20th century, which is either we leave all of those decisions up to the competitive market and participate merely as consumers, or we participate as citizens of nation states and submit to being part of hierarchical state-based organizations. There are, of course, advantages to both markets and states. And no one is suggesting that we will do away, well, some people are. I'm not necessarily suggesting we do away with either, but rather that both be subordinated to a third opportunity or a third way of thinking, which is about the commons, which I'll talk about in a moment in more detail. And I'll try and sketch out some of the principles of the commons that might guide that. But essentially we're at a moment where we may be able to coordinate the production of the necessities of life, the commodities and objects and processes that we need without necessarily relying on states or necessarily relying on markets, but rather relying in different ways on one another. And this is a very exciting opportunity, but also an incredible generational, maybe multi-generational challenge. And it's a challenge if we choose to go down that path that's going to rely on all of our intelligence and all of our capacities in order to create that sort of world. The problem as I see it is that this realization that new forms of cooperation are abundant, that they're possible, and that people are already using them, is not one that's limited simply to the idea of the commons and to the idea that we should have egalitarian social relations based on free and open cooperation between people, which I honestly believe is the way that we need to move as a society. This has also been recognized by capitalism itself. Capitalism is no longer just, it is this as well, but it's no longer just this system of dominating factory institutions where people go and spend 8 to 10 hours a day hammering widgets and creating physical commodities. As we know, the forms of exploitation that are becoming increasingly common today are ones that are based on precarious work, cognitive labor, relational work, trying to tap and harness our capacities to work together in different ways. So essentially I would suppose as a sort of initial dichotomy that we're in a moment where the nature of work, the nature of social cooperation is changing, but it's changing based on two competing visions or systems. And one of them is the vision or system of the commons, and the other is the vision or the system of a sort of entrepreneurial idealism, which would say, yes, be creative, cooperate, create common atmospheres, create horizontal democracy, do whatever you like, but do it within the scope of the market. Do it as a way in order to participate and survive within a society that is fundamentally hostile to your conditions of existence. Do it as a means of survival. And I think the vision of the commons is one that would say, yes, let's cooperate in new ways, let's find new ways of working together and reproducing the necessities of our social life, but with a vision to overturning the dominance of the market in society. And rather turn markets into one way in which we perform the commons. Because markets, in terms of places where you can buy or sell things with some sort of abstract, centralized commodity like some form of money, are not inherently bad. They become inherently bad when they become the dominant mode of thinking through all social relationships. And when you have a global integrated marketplace that's based on horrific exploitation of people on the planet. So I think this is the sort of the contest that we're now seeing in terms of the ideologies or visions of what a society could look like based on the new technologies of cooperation and collaboration that we're developing. Will it be one based on the ideal of the commons, which is based on an idea of abundance and an idea of democracy and horizontalism, or will it be one based on this mythology of entrepreneurship, which is going to be based on basically making us all into competitive economic agents with one another, struggling for survival within a hostile economic ecosystem. And the most difficult aspect of drawing that dichotomy is, as I think will come clear in our discussions later, and as you probably already experienced, there's no easy or clean line between these two visions. They overlap, because both draw on one another in different ways. And as complex human subjects who are trying to survive within a hostile economic ecosystem, we end up bridging both in many of our actions and relationships. So, we'll come back to that point about the ambiguities and how we might disentangle the two in a moment. What I want to do for you now is map out how I'm thinking about the commons in 3 different frames. And the frames, of course, overlap. These are very arbitrary ways of talking about this, but I think they're important because otherwise it's easy for the commons to just remain this sort of euphemism or a feel-good term that doesn't have a lot of substance, and then it very easily becomes enrolled or conscripted into service of this sort of competitive entrepreneurial ideal. So I'm going to talk about 3 frames of the commons. The first is talking about what I'll call the actuality of the commons, then I'll talk about the art of the commons, and then I'll talk about the design of the commons to bring us to the topic of today's talk. So, to begin with the actuality of the commons, and this gets a little confusing, and I wish I actually had created a diagram for this, because there are 3 subsections of this actuality of the commons. By the actuality, one of them is what I'll call the natural commons, and then the built commons, and then the cognitive commons. And then we'll zoom out again and go to the art and the design of the commons as well. So the actuality of the commons, I'm thinking about actually existing common efforts, ways in which people are actually creating shared sources of value and shared means of reproducing their life together. So, to begin with, and also to give some sense of history, we can talk about the natural commons. The natural commons are those aspects of what we used to know as the natural world, and I'll problematize this term in a moment, that we rely on. So the oceans, the rivers, the soil, the seeds, those non-human, or as post-human scholars encourage us to think of them as more than human aspects of our world on which we rely. The atmosphere itself is a natural commons. The natural commons are those lands, those waters, those atmospheres that we share together and that we necessarily all rely on for our survival. As we know, many of these commons have already been privatized or enclosed. So many rivers, many lands have been sold off and made private property that can be enjoyed only by those who have legal and economic access to them. But inherently, these forms of the natural world, the forests, the beaches, the seafront, these are or should be common. And by common here, we're going back to the root of the word, at least in English, which was a designation for lands within medieval England. After centuries of struggle between the peasants and the aristocracy, by the Middle Ages, the peasants had won a legal right, essentially, to tend certain amounts of land in common, which meant that they had autonomy over those lands, though they were the ownership is a poor word to use in these times because modern property laws were not yet existent. But even though these lands would be under the domination of a lord or an aristocrat, the commoners, the peasants, had the right to use that land in any way they saw fit, and it couldn't be taken away from them or stripped from them until a bit later. And what we know from the historical record, as well as examples of peasant and indigenous societies today, is that they used this land very, very creatively. This land was used in order to raise animals for food and for textiles. It was used to grow market gardens as well as subsistence gardens. It was also used for festivals. It was used as a space of conviviality. At times it was used as a meeting place for peasants. It was essentially the common, and the word here, resource, is not adequate because it's something that we impose with our language onto the past, but a common resource for the community to use. And importantly, contrary to a sort of mythology that's been built up about these in recent years, these were very, very intentionally, creatively, and democratically managed in almost all societies where they were present. So the commons refers to the historical example, but it also refers to a way of thinking about common resources. Resources, again, here in quotation marks. That these resources, whether they're lands, whether they're rivers, whether they're oceans, need to be tended together. That they provide our means of reproduction, that they provide fish, that they provide food, that they provide space where we can cooperate in new ways. But also that we need to be active participants in reproducing them. That the ocean and that the forest and the field will not simply be fine on their own, but they need to be the subject of democratic governance. That we need to really think intentionally about reproducing them. Because if we don't, if we simply allow them to be used in any way or allow them to be privatized and used as to create commodities, then we run into circumstances where the resource becomes exhausted, where it becomes private and access to it is limited, and where that resource can be exhausted or destroyed. So when we talk about the commons, we're talking about something that existed historically, but also something that exists in the present. And ideally, what we would have done last week at the Paris Climate Talks as a species is recognized that the climate is a commons that we need to care for collectively using democratic processes that go beyond commodification and also go beyond the sort of top-down domination of nation states in decision-making. Unfortunately, we, through our duly elected representatives, made a very different and very unfortunate choice to continue to treat the atmosphere essentially as a commodified space that we will address and that we will manage through a set of commodified practices, carbon taxes, carbon trading schemes, other frameworks to basically understand this shared resource, this shared thing that we depend on and that we need to reproduce differently, as something akin to a marketplace, which I think is deeply tragic and will, of course, have deeply tragic effects. So this is the natural commons, but of course the other thing that indigenous and post-humanist scholars encourage us to remember is that when we think about the natural commons, we should understand ourselves as part of that natural commons. We rely for our reproduction as a species, as individuals, as subjects, as bodies, on our relationship to nature, what we used to call nature. Unfortunately, this relationship is increasingly mediated by commodities, by money, by capitalism. Most of us have almost no relationship to the land anymore, especially those of us who live in cities, and as a result, it's allowing us to do incredible violence. And also to understand ourselves as somehow isolated from and superior to the rest of creation, when in fact we need to develop a much more sophisticated and robust understanding of how not only are we commoners, but we're also commoners along with rivers, along with animals, along with plants. This is a great challenge that we have to expand our thinking at this moment in time, to understand that network of cooperation and mutuality and reproduction as expanding well beyond just the human subject as we imagined it from the 19th century. So, this is the question of the natural commons. Then we can move on to the idea of the built commons, what I'm calling the built commons. And the built commons are probably a little more familiar to you. These are community centers, these are cooperatives, these are activist spaces, these are assemblies, these are all of those different structures that we build together to tend our common life. These are the things that we would more readily associate with commons. These are the human creations, the cultural institutions, the physical and organizational structures that we build to cooperate on different terms. So for instance, I'll give you the example from Greece, where I was just visiting, of the solidarity clinics. In Greece, as you know, the austerity regime is hit extremely hard. Many people have no longer any access to healthcare through the state because their insurance has been cut off. And as a result, communities have come together to provide healthcare to one another. They're receiving the labor of retired and active healthcare practitioners within their community. They're taking donations of pharmaceuticals. They're occupying spaces or renting spaces in order to provide healthcare to one another as a form of care and social reproduction outside of the market and outside of the state. This is a good, I can speak more about this example during our discussion in a moment. But this is a good example of the built commons. It's something that a community builds together in order to provide themselves autonomous means of social reproduction, new forms of cooperation. We can also look to new forms of non-monetary or paramonetary community markets. We can look at different forms of social centers that have been established in many years. Often these new commons, community gardens, emerge in moments of crisis when access to social reproduction under the capitalist regime starts to fall apart for many people. And they realize, once again, they need to rely on one another in order to survive. But of course, these commons are also the subject of enclosure. Enclosure refers to that process that occurred as the transition was happening between the Middle Ages and the capitalist period, roughly from 1500 to 1800, 1900 in Europe, where those common lands I mentioned before that were tended and cared for by peasants together were seized by elites, where they were turned into private property. And this was a very violent process that took several centuries to complete. But essentially what it meant is that the aristocrats or a new class of bourgeois, capitalists who came to take over the land from the aristocrats began to throw the peasants off the land and began to literally enclose the commons in fences and use that land for grazing animals that could be harvested to be sold on the market. This created a huge surplus population of people who could no longer reproduce their life autonomously. They no longer had access to the land and the commons that had allowed them to cooperate and reproduce their life together. And as a result, they were forced into various forms of exile, whether that exile was the city, whether that exile was the colony. And in fact, in the colonies as well, this same process was occurring, where indigenous lands and lands of other civilizations were being seized and transformed into private property for the enrichment of a few. The population that used to rely on those lands had their means of reproduction seized, and therefore became dependent on a commodity-based economy. These are the roots of our present moment. So today, we also have new forms of enclosure as well. It's not only the enclosure of land, which is of course still going on around the world as my country of Canada seizes people's lands to build mines, or there's a new generation of land grabbing where land is being privatized and sold to the highest bidder in order to speculate on the future value of agriculture, because many financiers and corporations know very well that unrestrained climate change is going to create huge shortages of water and food in the near future. So there's a great commodification of land going on in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America as well. So these new enclosures are occurring on the level of land, on the level of the natural commons, as these things become increasingly commodified. But they're also occurring on the level of the built commons as well. In the sense, and I'll give you one example of gentrification. People move to lovely neighborhoods here in Porto, in my city in Halifax, because they are the products of common labor. Those of us who've lived in those neighborhoods for generations put in time, effort. We cooperated to create a form of life together, both in terms of the built environment and in terms of the cultural environment that we wanted to live in. We created value in those spaces. And we enjoyed that value in those spaces for a time. Now we're seeing increasingly, with the greater mobility of financial capitalism, a new enclosure of that space, a new enclosure of our common labor. A way that that's becoming increasingly financialized and commodified in order to be sold to an international class of property speculators or an international class of tourists, those who've been gifted or granted privileged status by this order of global competition that we are now all living under. Oh, sorry. Okay. I thought someone was like...
I whispered Central London to Susanna. She's going to in a couple of hours.
Right, so you can witness it firsthand. But we also see this too in terms of many of our processes. So as I was mentioning, over the last few years, we've developed all sorts of techniques over the last maybe 2 decades in order to cooperate differently, whether they're co-working spaces, whether they're social centers, whether they're forms of what now is being called entrepreneurship, new forms of cooperation outside of large corporations or the state. And these ideas too are being enclosed and commodified. These are being told to us again as ways that we should be able to reproduce our life, but only within a context that we don't choose, within a context of a very violent marketplace that increasingly just wants us to rely on ourselves and only ourselves to survive. So enclosure, this idea of enclosure, which we get from the colonial period and from this transition to capitalism, is also a very useful metaphor for talking about what is happening to our built commons and our natural commons today. The final aspect of the actuality of the commons as I'm discussing them is what I'll call the cognitive commons. And these are our shared realm of ideas, knowledge, what is now being called intellectual property, the shared realm of culture, all of these, the shared realm of codes, software, that is increasingly, of course, as we know today, being enclosed in various ways. So those of you who know about the histories of the internet, yes, it began as a military technology, literally built to allow the American military to withstand a nuclear war, which they were actively pursuing, or the possibility of which they were actively pursuing. But in the period of the 1980s and 1990s especially, this became an incredible realm of common creativity, where people would collaborate based on their own free will and desire to share and to build something together. And they created common platforms, common forms of software. Only in the 2000s to see many of these commodified and enclosed and turned into sources of profit. And today we're seeing a similar process going on with the so-called development of the sharing economy. Of course, many aspects of the sharing economy are highly desirable, they're very useful, but we're seeing increasingly that the sharing economy, as distinct from a commons-based approach is one based on the marketization and monetization of common goods, whether they're a room in your home, whether they're an hour of your labor, whether it's the iron that you can lend to someone else. There is a move afoot to allow us to continue to organize ourselves in horizontal, cooperative, and non-hierarchical ways through the internet and through digital platforms, but have that all mediated by money. Similarly, we're seeing a vast wave of enclosure over things like seeds or DNA by corporations like Monsanto. And of course, a huge enclosure of intellectual property rights in the cultural realm by major corporations that wish to prevent us from sharing culture, which honestly should be our commons. So these are the forms of the actuality of the commons. These are the forms that the commons takes in the world in which we live. The natural world, the built environment, and the cognitive sphere. The last two aspects of the commons I'll speak about, and then, because I don't want to go on much longer, are the arts of commoning and the design of the commons. So by the arts of commoning, I'm speaking about the idea of the commons not as things that exist, but as a set of processes. When we hold something in common, whether it's a social center, whether it's a river, whether it's a form of code or intellectual work that we're doing together, this isn't just something that exists in the world, it's the product of our shared labor and our new forms of cooperation. So commons is better thought of as commoning. It's a constant process of reevaluation and reflexivity. And for commons to actually be commons and not to be this sort of strange form of entrepreneurial cooperation that we're all being encouraged to undertake, they need to be based on a shared set of value. One of them is that this process of commoning, whereby we reproduce the means of our own reproduction, whether it's a farm, whether it's a social space, whether it's a solidarity clinic, whether it's a platform for sharing knowledge, they need to be horizontal. They need to be based on a rejection of rigid hierarchies of control and domination. They need to be decentralized in the sense that they can't be subject to one central command center that determines how all of the different aspects of this initiative should be shaped. They need to be based in participatory democracy, which is distinct from representative democracy in the sense that it relies upon the active, thoughtful, and intentional collaboration of everyone involved, and not simply the election of people to take care of business for us. They need to be self-organized. They need to be egalitarian. And by egalitarian here I mean both that the rewards and the labor to reproduce those commons are shared equally, or as equally as possible, but also that we recognize that the inequality that haunts commons and haunts our society are based on many, many different axes. So by talking about commons as egalitarian spaces, it also implies a commitment to confront sexism, to confront racism, to confront the legacies of colonialism, to confront all these forms of power that continue to haunt our consciousness, even when we intentionally go out to try and create commons. They need to be ecologically minded. They have to understand themselves as being cooperation between human and non-human actors, or more than human actors. They need to be convivial, in the sense that they need to be enjoyable. People need to like working in them. You don't have to like it all the time. It's hard work. Sometimes you can't stand the people that you're working with, of course. But they need to be spaces of collective joy and not simply collective sorrow and overwork. And they need to be spaces that are reciprocal. That is, they need to be spaces where we care for the commons and the commons cares for us, where we reproduce one another in a relationship and a feedback loop. In this sense, I think that they fundamentally reject a logic of commodification, and often, but not always, are allergic or hostile to a logic of money as well. Money, of course, in this society is almost impossible to avoid, but commons-based efforts, if they are to avoid being co-opted into the entrepreneurial ethos, need to be very suspicious of money at all times. So the arts of the commons, what I'm speaking about here, and the reason why I call it an art, is that these values I've just listed are values that can shape and let's just say shape the way that we cooperate together. But the actual nature of our cooperation is fundamentally sublime. We as cooperative species are never fully aware of what we're capable of. Our capacities to cooperate exceed our imaginations. As a result, when we think about these values and we think about the actual daily processes and the ethos that might animate the commons, we need to understand it as a practice of artfulness. And we need to harness and depend upon art more than ever in order to awaken us both to what we have in common and what we could have in common, but also the limits of the commons that we've created. We need to rely on art in order to render us more aware of what we could be, how we could be more common, or what the limits of the commons should be. So finally then we come to the question of the design of the commons. If the arts of the commons are those broad sets of values and the framework and thinking of cooperation that might animate them, that is fundamentally beyond our imagination, the design of the commons speaks finally to the processes, the technologies, and the techniques that we are actually going to use in order to cooperate differently. And this becomes a question of how to design systems that can allow us to fulfill those values of horizontality, decentralization, grassroots participatory democracy, self-organization, egalitarianism, ecological thinking, conviviality, and reciprocal transformation. How can we actually create techniques and technologies to allow us to do this? And by techniques and technologies, I'm speaking of everything from computer platforms to techniques for holding a meeting together, techniques for making democratic decisions together, both in physical space and also across vast distances. These are the questions of the design of the commons. How can we actually create the tools that we need in order to reproduce our life differently? And to a certain extent, of course, this might take the form of how do we build an actual physical structure together. But it can also take the form of how are we going to remediate damaged lands that have been damaged by pollution or overused. How are we going to replenish the oceans, for instance? How are we going to address climate change on a different level than relying simply on the nation state or the market? So these processes and technologies have a great task ahead of them, which is how to allow us to collaborate on a day-to-day level with one another in more effective, enjoyable, and productive ways, but then also, fundamentally, how we can scale it up. Because if we are going to seize upon the potential to organize our social life differently, then we need to do so not only just on the level of the local economy or our personal relationships, we actually need to figure out ways of building a whole different society. If we truly want a modern medical system, we need to figure out ways of building an MRI machine that doesn't rely on Siemens or other major corporations which withhold these fruits of our common labor from us for a profit. We need to figure out, unless we want to live in a society without them, we need to figure out how to make such a decision in any case. We need to figure out how to create something, maybe not to rival, but to replace the iPhone. We need to think of ways that we can organize a huge amount of social cooperation on a global scale, with thousands and thousands and thousands of people acting and cooperating in different ways to coordinate a whole world of commons. These are the huge challenges that are ahead of us as people who are thinking through design. But the final thing I would say about design of the commons is it's not only a matter of designing the infrastructure and the technology. It's also a matter of using some of the tools that have been developed in design over the last few years to think through what is the vision going to be? What is it that we want to be the dominant paradigm that replaces the one that is clearly not working? Because we're now at a point where I think there's a dawning realization among almost everyone, although maybe not enough of us yet, that as long as we wait for either the market to save us or a state actor to save us, we're totally lost. The reality is that the market, as it has emerged in the last few years, is fundamentally predatory and is not dedicated to happiness or sustainability for most of us. The market as it is existing in capitalism right now will restructure the globe so that 10% of the population enjoy something that approximates a middle-class lifestyle, and 90% of us struggle to survive. That is the future It's just being redistributed from the global north all around the world in some way. That's not a vision I think we can sustain, because it's fundamentally one of misery and precariousness for most of us, and ecological destruction. By the same token, that force of capitalist globalization has so dramatically weakened and undermined the nation state that it's hard to imagine that any government anywhere in the world could withstand it. And we saw in Greece a very good example of what happens when a state tries to withstand it, unless there's a huge amount of social pressure from below that would allow such a government to take very bold and dramatic actions. I'm not against using the apparatuses of the state in various ways, but I think we need to recognize that the latitude and the capacities of the nation state to oppose capitalist neoliberal austerity depends on having the commons mobilized from the grassroots. If that isn't there already, then the capacity of any government, no matter how benevolent or angelic, is extremely limited. If we do not find ways of cooperating and sustaining and reproducing our lives outside of the market, now, here and now, then even the best political party in the world will not be able to withstand the pressures of global capital. So it's not that I'm totally against state-based solutions. Obviously, there are certain things that states do quite well if they're under democratic control and not under financial control. But I think we need to recognize that any capacity that a nation-state would have in this moment is going to fundamentally depend on there being strong, vibrant commons at the grassroots. And that, in turn, is going to depend on us developing a framework for thinking of how to build the processes of social cooperation and social reproduction outside of the sort of blackmail of entrepreneurialism, where we only do this because we have to survive, and we're simply waiting for the market to come and save us again, or to be recognized finally for the work that we've done. I think we need to abandon that hope that will somehow, that is being sold to us by all of our political leaders now, that if we simply work hard and use our creativity and ingenuity in order to survive as individuals, we'll be able to withstand the storm. I don't think that's true. I think that it will simply reproduce the system that is fundamentally not in our interests. Rather, we can use those forms of creativity, collectivity, cooperativism, and if we develop a strong design and artistry towards the commons, I think we can actually start from the grassroots to build a networked alternative that could perhaps, if we're lucky, be capable of overcoming the system that is today destroying most of our lives on the planet. I spoke for too long. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.